You talked about in the article, or you mentioned you're seeing like a rise of, there is a rise of socialism around the world, or a threatened rise of socialism. Do you see this as a rejection of capitalism? Why is this happening?
The pie is growing at a much slower rate.
Right.
When does a civilization feel confident? It feels confident when it's expanding. It's expanding when the economic pie is growing fast enough that generally standards of living are being raised. People feel that they have opportunity, prospects. That trend has reversed, not just in the United States, but
we're
across the world.
experiencing it.
Yep.
Yeah, in the UK, we were experiencing it.
Absolutely. And so what happens when the pie starts to shrink? Well, people start clamoring over the existing resources, and calls for redistribution become louder. Calls for punishing corruption become louder. This often, becomes a kind of populism. People like to say right wing or left wing, but I don't really think those terms are appropriate. I think there's a kind of inchoate sense that the elites, as such, they've gotten too top heavy. And that is, in fact, materially the case. Elites consume more resources than any other stratum of the population. And as, they have children, they reproduce and they expand generation after generation. They want all of their children to be situated also as elites. And so you can't have a shrinking economic pie and a growing elite base forever. Eventually, the elites also start to feel constraints. And really, there's a historian, Peter Turchin, who argues that prior to the advent of capitalism in the agricultural world, it was actually these battles between elite factions that spelled the end of empires.
I think during COVID, during the era of COVID and post-COVID, we really had a light shone upon a separation between them and us in two ways. I think during the COVID era, we had the light shone on this kind of separation between the elites and the peasants in that. And I think it was in two ways.
Yeah.
With the numbers that were published, how some of the richest people in the world got much richer. And then we all saw, companies had to close down, bakeries, ice cream shops. I mean, we had Michael Malice in here yesterday. He was talking about how he left New York. He said all the interesting little quirky shops, they've all closed, all the cafes, the ice cream shops. We saw all that, but we also saw the ridiculous thing where there would be some kind of event, a Met Gala or whatever. Nobody was wearing a mask, but all the staff were.
Yeah.
And I think it was the kind of like this really grotesque display of separation between elites and everyone else.
Yeah.
Look, there's always going to be wage disparities. There is always going to be rich and poor. But to have it so grotesquely put in people's face, now you add to that since then, a lot of suspicion about the truth that's coming to us. We've seen a lot of suspicion with regards to media. I mean, Malice corrected me to say mainstream media, call it corporate media, but there's a lot of suspicion to the incentives now. So I feel like we're in this place of, teeter on potential revolution. And I don't say that lightly, but I just think people are fucking fed up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's true.
I don't want a socialist revolution though.
Well, yeah, every revolution is messy. And revolutions tend to replace one set of elites with another. The question of whether or not they affect actual structural change that will materially uplift the condition of the people is a whole separate question. And, in some cases, redistributive revolutions have had near-term equalization effects. But the problem with mere redistribution is that if you're not generating the economic flywheel, if you're not preserving the engines of wealth generation, then you're going to just run into the same problem that the past regime ran into. And this is why capitalism matters. It's not because it's morally virtuous. It's because it's the most reliable social technology we have for growing the pie. Like before the 19th century, like net world economic growth was almost stagnant. Like most people would make the same amount like of money or resources for their entire life. And that also meant the pace of social change was much slower. But once the Industrial Revolution hits, once capital becomes a technology, you start just seeing spikes in economic growth and much faster changing standards of living, culture change, education, science. I mean, everything takes off, which is not to say that it's been great for everybody, but there is no meaningful alternative that doesn't shrink the pie.
And shrinking the pie is what leads to famine and
rolling
hunger.
Revolution.
Well, yeah, and potentially millions of deaths. The reason we had Malice in was we were talking about the Soviet Union and what happened under their communist revolution. Tens of millions of people died. Was it tens of millions? Millions? Maybe a couple of tens of. I don't know the numbers. But a lot of fucking people died.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that
you can't destroy the productive class.
Right. And Lenin actually realized this. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a period of time when the Communist Party wanted to, do away with money. They dissolved the central bank. They printed quadrillions of rubles, just literally hyperinflated the currency away. People began, bartering just to go about their daily lives. And Lenin quickly realized that he actually couldn't build the Soviet Union into an industrial power without some value, some stable peg of value that could be a store of wealth and a medium of exchange. So he brought back the central banker and reestablished a bank, reissued the currency, and in fact embraced something called the New Economic Theory, which was also the model for Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China. That led it to be basically a market economy. So Lenin's thinking was that you actually had to have entrepreneurial activity. The small business, the entrepreneur, and the worker were all united in this common cause of building the socialist republic. And the early USSR actually saw some of the fastest economic growth rates in the world because they were an agrarian economy industrializing. And whenever you do that, your GDP goes through the roof because you're literally exponentially increasing your productive capacity.
So where did the Soviet Union fail where perhaps China has succeeded?
So that's a great question. And I am not a historian of either of these places in enough depth to probably answer it satisfactorily.
Okay. Can you point us where we should look? Yeah,
but I would suggest, some of the major reasons that have been identified for the slowdown in growth in the Soviet Union is interestingly around a kind of resource protectionism. So not wanting to basically be self-sufficient, which is I think a noble intention. But when your economy is growing, sometimes there need to be periods of time when you are reliant on foreign sources of whatever. There also was this phenomenon whereby the state kept plowing resources into factories that were no longer productive. So it was a kind of propping up, again, well-intentioned, not wanting these, workers to lose their jobs, these factory towns to basically become immiserated. I mean, look what happened in Detroit, or the United States, we just kind of abandoned that city. The Soviet leadership didn't want to do that because, after all, it was supposed to be a workers' party. But the problem with that is that the factories weren't solvent. They weren't able to keep up with the productive demands of a growing economy. And so eventually the state just couldn't prop it up anymore. The state does run out of resources. And we're seeing, these cascading defaults start to happen around the world now. The United States is in a privileged position because all of our debt is denominated in the currency that we print. And so there's a bandwidth that we have to kind of print away our insolvency for a certain period of time. But eventually, the question of real value always catches up with you. Is your productive economy able to support the level of debt that you have? And I would suggest the answer is no.
So can we talk specifically about China? For a country, an authoritarian country, it has been economically successful over the last, what would you say, 2 decades?
So the real kind of post-Mao reforms started happening in the late 70s, early 80s. And they've continued dramatically. And now the problem is, China's facing many of the same problems as the United States, which is that they have a tip-top elite of super rich people, many of whom have been engaged in scandals around, not paying taxes and incurred public outrage around ostentatious spending and lavish lifestyles. And so the Chinese state is really trying to ramp that in or reel that in.
Dissent also.
Right. And so this is the problem with the exercise of state power. It's always, framed publicly in these virtuous ways. We're fighting corruption, we're fighting terrorism, we're fighting money laundering, we're fighting crime. But, as we're fighting all this other stuff, we may also fight the people who are genuinely criticizing us for reasons that we need to be criticized.
I mean, Jack Ma has just agreed to step down from Alibaba. What's the wider company? Is the Alibaba the main company?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Did you see this?
I did
this
not.
week.
Ant Group.
Yeah. So Ant Group. So have you got the article? Because he went missing for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because he had been, I think, only mildly critical. Mm-hmm. And so he'd been missing for a while, probably in some re-education camp somewhere. To give up control of China's Ant Group. Jack Ma will seek control of Chinese fintech giant Ant Group, the company announced following the Communist Party crackdown on the nation's tech sector that targeted the characteristic billionaire. One of China's most blah, 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 blah. But the former teacher had retreated from public view since Beijing torched Ant's planned an IPO in Hong Kong following his barbed comments about government regulators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also met publicly with Trump, which I saw someone comment recently that, in China, if you're a captain of industry, you cannot also be a diplomat.
Right.
If you try to cross into the sphere of politics, it's sort of overstepping your bounds.
Yeah, I mean, but he was critical of the regulators and suddenly disappeared, and now he's back and he's going to up control his group. It's very authoritarian, and but it's. I guess the thing I wanted to talk about is even as an outsider, we're all very critical of China, despite us, having iPhones and such. We're all very critical of China. But they have also managed to grow their economy. Mm-hmm. I mean, you said they've lifted 750,000 people out of poverty.
750 million.
Sorry, 750 million people out of poverty. Yeah. And so, what are the trade-offs here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly right. The question that many U.S. elected officials are asking openly now is, why can't we be more like China? And that chorus is only going to grow.
But that's actually very anti-American because all the films and TV shows that kind of refer to the, I don't know, this may be the era of the 50s, 60s. It was are they communists? Where are the commies? It seemed to be everything America stood for was anti-communism.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And the threat of the expansion of communism around the world.
Right.
And now, I mean, I know that they're not communist anymore, even though they're the Chinese Communist Party. There is a certain amount of entrepreneurial spirit, but they certainly are authoritarian.
Yeah. There's an economist who recently wrote about how the main paradigm of political economy going into the 21st century is not capitalism or socialism, but a dirigiste economy. So that's a French term for a market economy that is centrally directed. So it's neither, full single party economic planning, nor is it free markets. It's the state is kind of the benevolent steward of the market, and takes a very active role in shaping the market. And I would suggest that, China's perhaps on a more authoritarian end of that spectrum, but most Western governments at this point aren't that different, aren't materially different. They may, in their rhetoric and in their cultural traditions, have these traditions of liberty, but in practice, the state is sort of seen as the arbiter of virtually everything, from speech to economic transacting to
gas stoves.
Yeah. I mean, like literally every little thing. And again, we talked about the hammer and the nail problem. Like, you have a huge military, you're going to use it. The political class, their mandate is to pass laws. And so they tend to approach solving problems by passing more laws instead of thinking about,
I'm sorry, the reason I'm giving a nod to Danny, you know what I'm thinking?
It's the Mark Moss quote.
It's the Mark Moss quote. What is it?
Every new law, whether good or bad, means less freedom, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unless it's a law to remove a bunch of laws. But yeah, generally speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the laws, we never get less laws. Like, we don't get fewer laws. We get more laws. We get a more complex layering of laws. And this then requires more administrators to interpret the laws and more complexity in the layers of governance that oversee these societies. And so the state gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That trajectory isn't going to be reversed through rhetoric. It actually, we need real action here, and it's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of resistance to it.